They believed their doctrine was unbreakable, a flawless engine of conquest, forged through fire and blood, tested on battlefield after battlefield. It was more than strategy, it was faith. Soldiers obeyed it without question. Commanders trusted it without hesitation. Victory, they believed, was written in its pages. But one forgotten clash would shatter that illusion forever. A single battle, overlooked by history, forced the enemy to confront a truth they could not escape. Their doctrine was not invincible. It was fragile. And it could be broken. The morning was quiet. Mist clung to the ground, covering rivers and forests in a shroud of pale silence. For the enemy, it was supposed to be another routine operation. Swift, methodical, inevitable. Their tanks rumbled forward with confidence. Their infantry marched in precise lines. Their artillery stood ready to pound resistance into dust. Their doctrine had carried them across nations. Why should this battlefield be any different? Yet hidden in the woods, defenders waited. They were not many, not heavily armed, not trained in conventional war. But they had something the doctrine never accounted for: unpredictability. They knew the terrain, the rivers, the ruined villages. They knew the weaknesses of a rigid machine, and they were ready to strike, not where the doctrine expected, but where it was most blind. The first clash came suddenly. A convoy rolled along a narrow forest road, armored vehicles at the front and rear, supply trucks in between. According to the doctrine, it was secure. According to reality, it was a trap. Explosives tore through the lead vehicle, gunfire erupted from the trees, and within minutes, what was supposed to be an unstoppable column was a twisted wreck. Survivors stumbled into the forest, only to vanish under silent fire. But to enemy commanders, this was nothing more than a nuisance, a delay, a small disruption in the larger plan. Doctrine said such resistance would collapse once pressed. And so, they pressed harder. By midday, entire battalions advanced across open fields, their artillery pounding ahead to clear the way. Villages were reduced to rubble before the infantry even arrived. Yet when the smoke cleared, no defenders waited in the ruins. Instead, attacks came from the flanks, from behind, from places no one expected. Supply lines were cut overnight. Bridges destroyed at the very moment they were needed. Ammunition convoys erupted in flames just as the front demanded shells. The doctrine required control. It demanded predictability. But what the enemy faced was chaos. And chaos was a language their doctrine could not understand. Night brought no peace. Patrols vanished without a sound. Outposts were found abandoned, weapons still warm, fires still burning, as if men had been swallowed by the darkness itself. Soldiers whispered of ghosts in the woods, of shadows moving through rivers, of enemies that struck and then disappeared. The doctrine said war was a machine, but here war felt alive, wild, untamed, and merciless. Commanders grew uneasy. Reports contradicted each other. Maps no longer matched the reality of the ground. Orders went out, but by the time they reached the front, the situation had already changed. The rhythm of war, once so steady, was broken, and then came the turning moment. A tank column moved to seize a critical crossroads, the kind of maneuver that had crushed countless enemies before. But as the armor rolled forward, the ground beneath them erupted. Mines detonated in perfect sequence, trapping the column. Molotovs and grenades rained from the surrounding buildings. Within minutes, steel monsters burned against the night sky. The crossroads remained in enemy hands, but the price was unbearable. By dawn, the doctrine itself began to unravel. Soldiers no longer trusted its promises. Officers no longer believed its guarantees. Each man who survived saw with his own eyes what the doctrine could not explain. Their enemy refused to fight by the rules, and by doing so they made the rules meaningless. And still, the forgotten battle was only beginning. The sun rose over a battlefield that no longer looked familiar. Smoke curled from the remains of burned-out vehicles, the stench of fuel and scorched metal heavy in the air. For the enemy, this was not the image they had expected. Their doctrine promised swift victory, clean advances, unstoppable momentum. Instead, their columns were scattered, their supply routes bleeding, and their soldiers whispering about things their manuals had never taught them to face. The machine of war was still moving, but its gears were grinding, straining against a battlefield that refused to obey. Commanders insisted the doctrine still worked. They barked orders with growing desperation. Artillery barrages to restore order, infantry pushes to reclaim ground, armored thrusts to smash resistance. But the defenders had already learned the rhythm of their machine, and they knew how to break it. They struck before the artillery could land, vanished before infantry reached them, and turned armored thrusts into death traps. Each counterattack was not a grand battle, but a cut, a wound that bled the doctrine one artery at a time. An entire regiment marched into a forest expecting to flush out guerrillas. They moved in neat formations, confident in their overwhelming numbers. Yet within an hour, chaos reigned. The first shots echoed from unseen ridges. Explosives collapsed trees across the road, blocking movement. Communications failed as runners disappeared into the undergrowth, radios jammed with static. Panic spread when fires broke out in the underbrush, smoke twisting through the trees, turning order into confusion. By nightfall, the regiment staggered out of the forest broken, not by superior firepower, but by a battlefield that punished their reliance on doctrine. Fear seeped into the ranks. Men began to disobey orders, not out of cowardice, but out of instinct. They no longer trusted that marching forward meant safety. They no longer believed their leaders could guarantee survival. Every step into the unknown forest, every bridge crossed, every convoy loaded, felt like walking into another trap. The doctrine demanded confidence. The reality bred terror. Enemy officers reported strange patterns. Ammunition stockpiles vanished overnight, stolen or destroyed. Roads once considered secure became ambush corridors. Civilians who appeared harmless by day seemed to guide defenders by night. There was no front line anymore, no clear division between safe and unsafe. The doctrine, built on predictability and precision, had no place for a war that slipped through its fingers like smoke. In desperation, commanders doubled their reliance on artillery. They unleashed barrages across entire regions, leveling villages, flattening forests, blasting rivers into chaos. But the shells fell on emptiness. The defenders did not stand and die, as the doctrine predicted. They melted away, only to strike again when the guns fell silent. For the first time, officers began to ask questions they had never dared speak. What if the doctrine itself was the weakness? By the third week, desperation grew sharper. Orders came to secure supply lines at all costs. Convoys rolled with heavy escort, tanks rumbling alongside trucks. Yet even then, the defenders adapted. They mined bridges, attacked at choke points, and struck in the dead of night when even escorts felt blind. Entire convoys vanished without a trace, leaving only smoldering wreckage by dawn. Soldiers whispered that the defenders were everywhere and nowhere, an enemy that could not be cornered. The cracks widened until they could no longer be ignored. An armored division, the pride of the doctrine, was ordered to advance through marshland to crush resistance. According to the manuals, heavy armor supported by artillery was unstoppable. But the marsh swallowed tanks whole. Engines drowned, tracks spun uselessly, vehicles sank into mud as defenders circled the edges, raining fire onto the bogged-down steel. The doctrine had never prepared for this. In a single night, what should have been a decisive victory became a humiliating disaster. By now, officers were fighting two wars, one against the defenders and another against their own disbelief. Soldiers who once followed orders with blind faith now questioned every command. Should we march into that forest? Should we cross that bridge? Should we trust that column of armor? The doctrine had promised certainty. What they faced instead was doubt, and doubt was poison. In one village, officers ordered a brutal reprisal, hoping terror would restore control. Buildings were torched, civilians executed, streets littered with bodies. The defenders did not come to stop them. Instead, they waited. Days later, the same unit that carried out the massacre was ambushed, annihilated in a storm of fire and steel. Survivors whispered that the battlefield itself was punishing them, that retribution came not from heaven, but from the very ground beneath their boots. The forgotten battle dragged on, no longer measured in victories or defeats, but in the erosion of faith. The enemy's once perfect doctrine was now little more than pages in a manual no one believed in. What good were rules when every rule was broken? What use were tactics when every tactic was countered before it began? And then came the night that turned cracks into collapse. A major counteroffensive meticulously planned, designed to restore dominance. The enemy committed thousands of men, tanks, and artillery. They advanced with grim determination, seeking to prove their doctrine still worked. But what they walked into was not a battlefield. It was a trap, vast and merciless. Mines detonated in precise waves, cutting off retreat. Bridges collapsed as armored columns surged forward. Fires erupted along supply lines, choking reinforcements in smoke and confusion. Defenders struck from every direction, not to destroy outright, but to disorient, to unmake the rhythm of doctrine itself. By dawn, the offensive was gone. Units had splintered, commanders were missing, and the machine of war had collapsed into fragments. Soldiers, once the embodiment of discipline, now fled in scattered groups, abandoning equipment, abandoning orders. Abandoning the very doctrine they once believed could never fail. The forgotten battle had not only cost them men and machines, it had stolen something far greater, their certainty. The enemy no longer marched with confidence. They moved with hesitation, eyes darting to the trees, ears straining at every sound. Their doctrine had promised structure, predictability, and order, yet the battlefield gave them only chaos. Entire companies advanced as if walking into fog, unsure whether the ground beneath their boots was solid or mined, unsure whether the silence ahead was safety or a trap. Every lesson drilled into them during training seemed useless. And still, commanders insisted the doctrine must prevail, but reality tore at their illusion. When the next offensive was ordered, the defenders did not resist head-on. Instead, they struck in ways the manuals had never prepared for. At night, saboteurs crept behind the lines, cutting telegraph wires, planting explosives beneath bridges, stealing supplies from guarded depots. When the offensive began at dawn, units discovered they were advancing without communication, without supplies, without certainty. And as they pressed forward, attacks erupted from flanks and rear, leaving soldiers surrounded, though no enemy front had been visible. The doctrine demanded control, yet control slipped through their fingers like water. One division attempted to force progress with overwhelming artillery. Shells thundered across hills and valleys, reducing villages to rubble, forests to splinters. For hours the earth shook, and commanders believed no defender could survive the storm. But when the bombardment ended and troops advanced, they found the ground empty. Then the counterattack came, not from the front, but from the sides, from tunnels beneath the ruins, from the river where defenders rose like shadows. Panic spread as men realized they had wasted their firepower on ghosts. Their manuals had taught them that artillery prepared the battlefield for victory. Instead, it had prepared nothing but silence. The failure bred anger, and anger bred mistakes. Officers ordered reckless pushes to prove their strength. Tank columns rolled forward without reconnaissance, eager to crush the elusive foe. They advanced into narrow valleys, where the walls of stone became killing grounds. Explosives rained from above, anti-tank fire burst from hidden nests, and the steel beasts that symbolized doctrine were reduced to burning carcasses. Survivors crawled from wreckage, choking on smoke, watching their invincible machines turn into twisted graves. For the first time, entire armored crews refused to climb back into their vehicles, declaring the machines had become death traps rather than weapons. The defenders did not fight for territory alone. They fought for time, for fear, for the unraveling of belief. Each ambush was not only a blow to numbers, but to morale. Soldiers began carving strange marks on their helmets and rifles, talismans of protection against an enemy they no longer understood. Some refused to march at night, claiming the darkness itself belonged to the defenders. Rumors spread faster than orders. Men swore they had seen shadows swimming rivers with knives in their teeth, or heard whispers in the woods moments before comrades vanished. These stories carried more weight in the ranks than the Doctrine's promises of certainty. A supply corridor became the next stage of collapse. Hundreds of trucks, escorted by armor, stretched for miles, carrying food, ammunition, and fuel. The Doctrine relied on such lifelines. Without them, the machine stalled. The convoy moved cautiously, headlights dimmed, soldiers scanning the roadside. Yet halfway through the route, the night erupted. Explosions shattered the lead vehicles, plunging the column into confusion. Gunfire from ridges rained down, mines detonated beneath wheels, and within minutes the convoy became a graveyard of fire and twisted steel. Survivors fled into the darkness, abandoning supplies, abandoning Doctrine. When the sun rose, smoke still curled from the ruins, and the machine of war found itself starving. Commanders could no longer deny the truth. The Doctrine was cracking. Their manuals, once sacred, were now filled with empty promises. And yet, instead of abandoning it, many clung tighter, believing faith could salvage what reality had destroyed. Orders came for another offensive, one grand push to prove the Doctrine still had teeth. Thousands of men marched, banners raised, artillery roaring, tanks leading the way. It was to be a spectacle of overwhelming might, a statement of dominance. The defenders let them come. They gave ground, retreating deeper into terrain they knew better than any map could show. Rivers swelled with spring floods, turning crossings into peril. Forests grew dense, forcing columns into narrow paths. And then, like a storm breaking, the defenders struck. Explosions collapsed bridges behind the advancing troops, cutting them off from retreat. Trenches disguised as farmland opened fire from yards away. Hidden artillery rained destruction on choke points. Panic surged through the ranks as men realized they were not advancing into victory, but into a carefully woven trap. For days, the battle raged with no rhythm. The Doctrine demanded sequence, artillery, advance, occupation. Instead, it faced chaos, ambush, retreat, reappearance. Entire units vanished without reports. Commanders lost contact with their men. Supplies dwindled as convoys burned. Some soldiers mutinied quietly, slipping into forests rather than marching forward. Others broke down openly, refusing to leave trenches when ordered. Fear had done what bullets could not. It broke the faith that bound an army together. The forgotten battle had reached its turning point. No longer was it about land or territory. It was about belief itself. The defenders had proven that the enemy's Doctrine could bleed, could fail, could collapse under the weight of unpredictability. And once that truth had taken root in the minds of soldiers, no order, no manual, no promise could erase it. By the end of the 6th week, commanders admitted what they had never dared before. Doctrine had betrayed them. It had led them into a battlefield that demanded flexibility, not rigidity. Creativity, not repetition. Their machine of war had been built for roads and open fields, not forests and rivers. And the men who once marched with certainty now walked with doubt, each step haunted by the memory of shadows in the night. The forgotten battle had not yet ended, but its outcome was already decided. Doctrine was broken. What remained was only survival. They called it survival, but in truth it was collapse. By the 7th week, the enemy's vaunted machine had become a shadow of itself. The doctrines once etched into every soldier's mind now felt like relics of a dead age. Commanders issued orders, but fewer obeyed. Maps no longer mattered. Lines of advance blurred into chaos. What had begun as a confident campaign now reeked of desperation. Yet even in despair, some clung to the belief that one decisive strike could turn the tide back in their favor. They gathered what remained of their strength. Units pulled from the front, artillery batteries positioned for maximum firepower, tanks repaired in haste. It was to be their redemption, an overwhelming blow that would prove their doctrine still lived. They whispered that the defenders could not withstand this storm, that the machine, though battered, still had power left to crush. The attack began with thunder. Shells rained across hills and rivers, the earth shaking under relentless fire. Tanks rolled forward, their treads churning mud, infantry following in dense waves. Smoke and dust cloaked the battlefield, and for a moment the enemy felt like their old selves again, unyielding, unstoppable. The Doctrine was alive in the roar of guns, in the grinding of steel, in the march of boots, but the defenders had been waiting. They did not contest the opening barrage. They let the enemy believe in their strength for hours, drawing them deeper into a killing ground, prepared with meticulous patience. When the tanks reached the marshes, the earth betrayed them. Engines bogged down, vehicles stuck fast, artillery rounds fell short into swamp water. Suddenly silence. And then eruption. Mines blasted in waves, ambush fire poured from hidden nests, and the marsh lit with fire. Steel coffins burned, while infantry scrambled in terror, realizing too late that they had marched into the jaws of their own arrogance. Still, the commanders refused to yield. They ordered reinforcements, but supply lines no longer existed. Bridges had been destroyed, convoys ambushed, fuel drained by weeks of sabotage. Reinforcements marched, but what they found was not a battlefield. It was a graveyard of their own doctrine. Columns of smoke rose like funeral pyres across the horizon, each one marking another piece of their machine that would never move again. At last, the truth sank in. This was not a battle they could win. It was not even a battle they could understand. Their doctrine had not simply failed. It had been exposed as brittle, naive, blind. The enemy's strength had always been numbers, coordination, precision. But against an opponent who fought without rules, who struck like shadows, who turned terrain into a weapon, the doctrine was worse than useless. It was a death sentence. And then came the twist, the revelation buried in whispers. Among the defenders, not all were soldiers of the state. Many were irregulars, villagers, workers, even children carrying messages through forests at night. The doctrine had failed not only against trained resistance, but against ordinary people who refused to yield. This was the true humiliation. Their polished manuals, their theories of conquest, their rigid formations had been undone by men and women who fought with nothing but will. The forgotten battle was not just military defeat, it was ideological annihilation. In the aftermath, survivors limped back across rivers and forests, their numbers thinned, their spirits broken. They carried stories of confusion, of invisible enemies, of rules turned meaningless. Commanders filed reports that masked the disaster, calling it a temporary setback. But among the men, truth spread like fire. The doctrine had been broken, and with it the myth of invincibility. Years later, when historians traced the evolution of enemy strategy, they found a sharp break. Tactics rewritten, formations abandoned, manuals revised with a quiet urgency. Official records never admitted why, but soldiers who had been there knew. They remembered the forests where columns vanished, the rivers that swallowed tanks, the villages that became ambush traps. They remembered the faces of defenders who never fought by the rules. And they remembered the night they realized doctrine was not a shield, but a chain dragging them to ruin. This battle faded from public memory, buried beneath grander campaigns and louder victories. Yet it lived in silence, shaping how wars were fought afterward. The forgotten battle forced an empire to rewrite its own beliefs. It was the moment when the machine of war cracked, when certainty died, when the myth of invincibility was shattered forever. And in that silence, one truth echoed louder than any gunfire: no doctrine, no matter how flawless it seems, can survive a battlefield that refuses to play by its rules. But while this forgotten clash broke one empire's doctrine, another power was already rising, forging a new set of rules, rules that would decide not just battles, but the very shape of the world to come.